So far, we have looked at several ways a function can be structurally placed in Model L. Vergence asked how a function appears in awareness. Current asked how it flows through the metabolism. Perspective asked where it stands inside the block. Now we move to array. Array asks a different question. When a function assesses something, how does it respond? Does it press its assessment forward? Does it hold it more provisionally? Does it steer toward a selected outcome? Or does it adjust to what the situation allows? In this video, we are looking at the 4 array groups: governing, accommodating, facilitating, and compliant. This is where Model L begins to describe assessment style, selective approach, steering, adjustment, and response. Before we go further, let's anchor this in the source vocabulary. In Kimani White's Model L terminology, array belongs to what he calls the complex dichotomies. This area corresponds to the familiar Model A contrast of inert and contact functions, or in Model L terms, governing and compliant. But Model L opens that twofold distinction into a more detailed structure. The first axis is expressive emphasis, emphatic versus tentative. This asks how firmly a function emphasizes, expresses, or settles its assessment. The second axis is selective approach, directive versus conducive. This asks how a function moves toward response, whether it steers toward a selected outcome or adapts to what supports and enables the response. Cross those two axes and we get the 4 array groups: governing, accommodating, facilitating, compliant. So the technical question behind this video is not simply, is the function strong or is it active? The question is, how does this function assess, select, steer, adjust, and respond? In the previous video, we looked at perspective or ensemble. Perspective asked where a function stands inside the block. Is it setting the requirement? Is it accepting the frame? Is it producing the response? Or is it supplying what the block needs? Array shifts the question. Now, we are not mainly asking where the function stands. We are asking how it behaves when it forms an assessment and moves toward response. Does it press the assessment forward? Does it hold the assessment more tentatively? Does it steer toward a selected outcome? Or does it adapt to the conditions that make a response possible? So array is not about visibility, flow, or position. It is about assessment style and selective approach. It shows how a function handles emphasis, selection, steering, adjustment, and response. The first axis behind array is called expressive emphasis. In plain English, this asks how firmly a function presses its assessment. An emphatic function tends to emphasize its assessment more strongly. It reaches conclusions with more firmness. It expresses its reading with more weight. It gives that assessment a stronger role in how the block responds. A tentative function works differently. It may still notice, evaluate, and contribute, but it does not press its assessment in the same way. It is more provisional, more moderated, more willing to test, adjust, or qualify what it is saying. But this is important. Emphatic does not simply mean strong. Tentative does not simply mean weak. A function can be tentative in expressive style while still playing an important structural role. So this axis is not measuring raw ability. It is asking, when this function forms an assessment, does it push that assessment forward with emphasis or hold it more provisionally? The second axis behind array is called selective approach. If expressive emphasis asks how firmly a function expresses its assessment, selective approach asks how the function moves toward response. A directive function steers. It selects a line of response and helps move the block in that direction. It is concerned with direction, choice, and enactment. It asks, what are we doing with this assessment? Where is this response going? What line should be followed? A conducive function works differently. It does not steer as directly toward a selected outcome. Instead, it adjusts to what supports, permits, enables, or conditions the response. It asks, what does the situation allow? What needs to be accommodated? What makes the response workable? But again, we have to be careful. Directive does not simply mean active or superior. Conducive does not mean passive, submissive, or inert. Conducive functions can be highly important. They make the response possible by adapting to the conditions around it. So this axis is about selective approach. Does the function steer toward a selected response, or does it adapt to what enables that response to happen? Now we can cross the two axes. The first axis was expressive emphasis, emphatic or tentative. Does the function press its assessment forward or hold it more provisionally? The second axis was selective approach, directive or conducive. Does the function steer toward a selected response or adapt to what supports and enables the response? When these two axes cross, they produce the four array groups. Emphatic plus directive gives us governing. This is the function that presses its assessment and steers the response. Emphatic plus conducive gives us accommodating. This still has strong expressive emphasis, but it adapts to conditions rather than directly steering them. Tentative plus directive gives us facilitating. This does not press its assessment as strongly, but it still helps guide the response. Tentative plus conducive gives us compliant. This neither presses emphatically nor steers directly. It adjusts to the selected conditions and works within them. So array is the structure of assessment and response. It tells us whether a function presses, adapts, guides, or complies within the movement of the block. The first array group is governing. Governing combines emphatic expression with a directive approach. So in plain English, governing functions press their assessment forward, and they help steer the response. They do not merely contribute a suggestion from the side, they give the block a firm line of assessment and help set the direction of movement. This is why governing corresponds to the familiar Model A idea of inert functions. Inert does not mean inactive. It means that the function is less easily reshaped by immediate contact with the situation. It holds its line more firmly. In Model L terms, governing is where assessment and direction come together. The function says, in effect, this is the assessment. This is the line to follow. This is how the response should be directed. But we should avoid turning this into ordinary personality language. Governing does not simply mean bossy. It does not mean dominant in every situation. And it does not mean the function is automatically strong. It means that structurally, this function presses and directs. It gives emphasis to the assessment and direction to the response. The second array group is accommodating. Accommodating combines emphatic expression with a conducive approach. So this is not a function that disappears into the background. It still presses its assessment with weight. It still gives a firm reading. It still says, this matters. But it does not steer the response in the same direct way as governing. Instead, accommodating works by adjusting to conditions. It asks, what does the situation support? What can be worked with? What needs to be allowed for? What would make the response possible? So accommodating has a strong, expressive emphasis, but a condition-sensitive approach. It presses, but it bends. It asserts, but it adapts. It gives weight to the assessment, but it works through what the situation permits. This is why we should not treat accommodating as weak or passive. It is not merely going along with things, it is more like a strong, adaptive mechanism, something that can absorb pressure, adjust to the shape of the situation, and still keep the system moving. So if governing says, this is the line to follow, accommodating says, this is the assessment. Now let's make it workable under these conditions. The third array group is facilitating. Facilitating combines tentative expression with a directive approach. So this is a function that does not press its assessment forward with the same weight as governing or accommodating. It is more provisional, more moderated, more willing to qualify what it is saying, but that does not mean it is passive, because facilitating is still directive. It still helps steer the response. It still guides the process. It still has a role in selecting where things are going. The difference is that it directs without making itself the loudest voice in the block. Facilitating can work quietly. It can guide indirectly. It can shape the line of response without insisting too heavily on its own assessment. It can help the system move in a selected direction while leaving room for adjustment, testing, or refinement. So facilitating is not simply weak expression. It is tentative expression combined with directional influence. If governing says, this is the line to follow, and accommodating says, this is the assessment, now let's make it workable, then facilitating says, here is a possible line, let's move this way. But let's not overstate the assessment before we test it. Facilitating guides without pressing, it directs the response, but it does so in a more moderated, provisional, and indirect way. The fourth array group is compliant. Compliant combines tentative expression with a conducive approach. So this is a function that does not press its assessment forward emphatically, and it does not directly steer the response. Instead, it adjusts. It works within the conditions already selected by the block. It conforms to what the situation requires, what the response allows, and what the other functions have already set in motion. But the word compliant needs to be handled carefully. This does not mean submissive, it does not mean obedient, it does not mean weak-willed. In Model L, compliant is not a personality trait, it is a structural style of functional response. A compliant function is condition-sensitive. It works with what has already been established, it adapts to the shape of the situation, it helps the system continue by fitting itself to the response already underway. So if governing presses and directs, accommodating presses but adapts, and facilitating guides without pressing, then compliant adjusts within conditions. It says what is already in motion. What does this response require? How do I fit this function to the situation as it stands? Compliant is therefore not about weakness, it is about responsive adjustment. It is the function working within the selected conditions rather than pressing or steering them itself. At this point, it helps to connect array back to the familiar Model A language. In Model A, this area is usually discussed as the contrast between inert and contact functions. In Kimani's Model L terminology, this corresponds most directly to governing and compliant. Governing functions are linked with the inert side. They form more firmly emphasized assessments, and they help set the decision-making direction of the block. Compliant functions are linked with the contact side. They are more flexible in how they conform to assessments and decisions that have already been set in motion. But Model L does something more detailed here. Instead of leaving this as one twofold contrast, it separates the hidden mechanism into two axes. First, expressive emphasis. Is the function emphatic or tentative in how it expresses assessment? Second, selective approach. Is the function directive or conducive in how it moves toward response? Once those two axes are separated, the old twofold contrast opens into four array groups: governing, emphatic, and directive; accommodating, emphatic and conducive; facilitating, tentative and directive; compliant, tentative and conducive. So the Model A bridge is still useful. Inert and contact give us the broad contrast, but array gives us the finer structure, how a function presses, adapts, guides, or adjusts in assessment and response. Now we can put the four arrays side by side. Each array describes a different style of assessment and response. Governing is emphatic and directive. It presses the assessment forward and it steers the response. So we can summarize it as governing, presses and directs. Accommodating is emphatic and conducive. It still gives weight to the assessment, but it works through the conditions of the situation. So, accommodating presses but adapts. Facilitating is tentative and directive. It does not press its assessment as strongly, but it still helps guide the response. So, facilitating guides without pressing. And compliant is tentative and conducive. It does not press emphatically or steer directly. It adjusts within the selected conditions. So, compliant adjusts and works within conditions. Taken together, these four groups show the structure of array. They tell us how a function handles emphasis and selection, how it gives weight to an assessment, how it moves toward a response, how it steers, adapts, guides, or adjusts. So array is not about whether a function is simply strong or weak, and it is not about whether a person is dominant, passive, flexible, or compliant in an everyday personality sense. It is a structural lens. It shows how each function participates in assessment, decision-making, and response within the larger Model L layout. So that is the basic orientation to array. In this video, we have added another structural lens to the Model L layout. Vergence showed how functions appear in awareness. Current showed how functions flow through the metabolism. Perspective, or Ensemble, showed where functions stand inside the block. And array has shown how functions assess, select, steer, adjust, and respond. The key idea is that array is not about ordinary personality traits. It is not simply asking whether someone is assertive, passive, flexible, or decisive. It is asking how a function participates structurally in assessment and response. Does it press and direct? That is governing. Does it press but adapt? That is accommodating. Does it guide without pressing? That is facilitating. Does it adjust within selected conditions? That is compliant. Together, these four arrays give us a more precise way of describing assessment style and decision-making approach inside the functional structure. In the next video, we move to another lens. Array has been about assessment and response. The next lens, interest, moves us toward attention, relevance, concern, and focus. So next time, we will look at the four interest groups: salient, adjunct, germane, and tangential.